Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing Robert Wright's The God Test. I'll talk very briefly about the author, go into an overview of what the book is, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. Robert Wright is an author. He is also a podcaster. He also did a lot of journalism writing in the early part of his career. He's probably best known now for being a podcaster. He podcasts on a podcast called Non-Zero, which was named after one of his earlier books. The first book of his I read was Non-Zero. I think it was called Non-Zero Sums, and I read that in the early 2000s. It was very good. But he writes a lot about science and technology as well as international relations, which plays a large role in this book, The God Test. What The God Test is basically a look at where we are right now as far as artificial intelligence writ large, how we got here, so kind of the early stages of artificial intelligence. He goes through the first part of the book and kind of giving an explanation of what artificial intelligence is and just kind of broadly how it works. He looks at questions of consciousness. Is AI conscious? Does it pass kind of the test of the Chinese room? He goes into, from that point, the middle part of the book is really what is the best case scenario for this technology? What is the worst case scenario? And then finally, towards the end of the book, he looks at international relations, how they could be impacted by the advances in AI. And he finishes up by kind of calling for the beginning of a kind of a broader global consciousness that he thinks will be needed in order to, if this technology continues to advance, will need to be kind of used to make sure we have like a good version of AI, not a bad version. And that is kind of the God test. The God test is this idea that over time, through advances in technology and advances in communication, we as a human species have kind of become more and more able to, I don't know if he would use the word tame parts of our nature, but also he would probably say there needs to be a global expansion of consciousness and compassion and understanding of other people. He goes into a large part of the book is about kind of cognitive biases that people have and how those are used to advance authoritarianism and tribalism, and how AI could be a tool to kind of decrease or mitigate some of those things. And he thinks we'll need to do that in case we do move towards something that is like Nick Bostrom thinks kind of what he calls a singleton, which is a concept where you basically have one government essentially run by an AI, either through an AI that's controlled by a human, but an AI, a super AI essentially. And he thinks, Robert Wright thinks, the more likely that we as human beings are compassionate and not distracted by like squabbles, then the more likely this AI will lead us to essentially a utopian future. So it's a lot of book. There are a lot of ideas in the book. I thought the explanation of how LLMs work, which is kind of the first part of the book, if you're just someone who wants to get into this and just kind of wants to get a bit of like how does this technology work and how do large language models work, I think the first part of the book does a really good job of explaining that for a pretty layman audience. I think he does a good job of explaining that. Kind of the history of what he calls the noosphere. I'm sure I mispronounced that, and how that kind of plays into some of his theories. I think he explains that pretty well, which is a concept that kind of goes back to the earlier part of the 20th century, and how there's this idea that there could be something akin to like a global consciousness. He goes into a large part of his concern is kind of the AI race with China, and he talks about how there is this accelerationist mindset that's happening because of you have he kind of calls out the CEO of Anthropic, who's a man named Dario, and Dario is something of a China hawk. He is a China hawk, and Robert Wright believes that between this and the all this money that's coming into AI, this kind of is leading us on this path towards the acceleration. And he believes that the more I would call him something of a somewhere between an anti-accelerationist and a doomer. And he thinks that this path towards acceleration, greater and greater acceleration, is ultimately a bad thing because there's not global governance that's in place to kind of manage these technologies. I thought that the book had a lot to recommend for it. It does sometimes feel like 3 or 4 books in one. Robert Wright writes with a very conversational style, and oftentimes when I was reading it, I would hear like his voice from his podcast in my mind, and you're either going to like that or you're not going to like it. He has a particular sense of humor that borders on corny, And so there's some kind of cornball humor moments in the book that, given like the seriousness of this topic, sometimes I was a little bit taken aback. In the heaven and he has kind of heaven and hell is kind of what he calls the section, but it's kind of all the things that could go wrong with AI and all the things that could go kind of right with AI. The amount of things that could go right are pretty limited in terms of the number. He takes this section basically verbatim from what Dario, who's the CEO of Claude, who wrote this like long, I think it's like a 50-page manifesto on kind of this idea of like, if you have this idea in AI space, if AI reaches a certain amount of power, can be used to revolutionize science, and you'll have something called the compressed century, which is you have 100 years of discoveries, scientific discoveries in a very, very short period of time. And that's kind of what Robert has as his, has kind of his heaven scenario. And I wish there had been a little bit more effort there into like coming in with other voices to see if that made sense. But otherwise, he just kind of takes that and just says, here's the best case scenario for this. And I wish there had been a little bit more there other than just the compression, basically the compressed century. I wish he had taken anybody else who's an anti-doomer who sees kind of the upsides of these technologies. I wish he had more voices in there than just kind of Dario's. But it did make it feel unbalanced as far as like all the great things that could happen, all the downsides that could happen. And so some of this stuff, like I said, because of the conversational nature, it does feel disjointed at times. You know, there's a point in the book where he talks about the need for governance and kind of a global governance. And that's really the large part of the end of the book, kind of the need for global governance and the need for expanded consciousness in order to kind of get us to this global governance. Robert is a practitioner of meditation. He has written books on Buddhism in the past. I don't know if he would claim himself to be a Buddhist. But in reading this, it was hard for me to kind of to crystallize his idea of what exactly needs to happen like today. Some of the stuff it deals with like how quickly we're moving with this technology. And so if the goal is to get us to a level of consciousness, it wasn't clear, like in the American context, is he talking about 10% of the people, 33% of the people, 50% of the people, a supermajority, everybody? So it wasn't clear exactly what the call to action there was. So I was a little left cold on that. And also just he kind of acknowledges throughout the book that the bodies of global governance, be it the World Trade Organization or the United Nations, have had their problems, and he acknowledges this, but he doesn't really spend a lot of time in the book kind of putting together what the alternative would look like and why it would work this time, other than to say, I think he believes it's more predicated on using, as I understand it, kind of using these technologies to remove some of these biases. It wasn't clear to me in reading a lot of this of why people would continue to use the technologies. A lot of the book seems predicated on this idea that people will choose to continue using these technologies, even if it's not clear if they always benefit them, which was a little confusing to me. The analogy between nuclear weapons and the artificial intelligence, I think, is an apt one, except for the fact that in the case of artificial intelligence, you have private corporations that are involved in this, and they have certain powers and rights in both the American context and the Chinese context that were absent in nuclear weapons. And so I understand what he's saying is having some kind of governmental body to put checks and balances on this stuff, and that makes sense to me. It's not quite clear that that's going to happen soon enough for us to that A, it's going to happen soon enough, B, that the corporate powers that be are going to let this go without a fight. It's not clear that the government that we have currently is going to allow that. And so there's all these kind of question marks that and I realize he's writing a book for kind of the future and not exactly for the right now. But there's some things when I was reading this, I was like, what you're calling for seems like a long project. And he does acknowledge in the beginning when he says, I'm calling for the beginning of consciousness and of kind of expanding consciousness and getting to this place. It wasn't quite clear to me, like, given the time frame that we're looking at, if we can just call for a beginning, or if we needed more kind of concrete steps in order to put together some kind of framework of agreement to limit what he sees to be a large problem. At one point, he does say, he says, without governance and without these changes, the likelihood of this technology is somewhere between incredibly destabilizing. He doesn't really explain what that means. At one point, he says, there'd be a loss of jobs, but it's not quite clear how many jobs it would be, And so that's on one end. And he basically says a complete and total catastrophe, like akin to like a nuclear war in like Terminator or something. And I think that there are, and this is one of those things where I'm not an expert on it, and this is his opinion, and he talks with a lot of experts on this. I would say that a lot of these experts obviously are self-interested and they're making money off this technology. So I think it's in their interest to kind of puff it up and what it can do and what it cannot do. I've seen estimates as low as like a 1% growth in GDP from the technology, which is impressive, but by no means is it like world changing. And so some of this kind of left me cold. I wish there had been a little bit more going outside of the experts on some of this stuff and just trying to talk to people who are just like academics or people who labor economists or people who are more business minded but outside the AI space to see what it's actually doing. A large part of the book in the beginning is kind of what this technology can do now, and so a lot of this kind of is predicated on the belief that this is going to keep expanding into the future and getting more and more powerful, which I think is likely. But then it leads to the other question I would have to him, which is to say, we're spending a lot of money, or companies are spending a lot of money on building these technologies. They presumably at some point want to profit back on their money. These are for-profit organizations. What is kind of the equilibrium point where there's a business case to be had for this technology where they're going to make their money back? So some of this is like this idea of like streaming television, right? So Netflix was able to get into the blue ocean and was able to make money off this thing because they were the first mover on it. I don't know if Peacock is going to ever make money. Many of the streaming companies have either folded or merged with others. It's not quite clear to me how the AI thing is going to sort itself out. At one point he kind of talks about having like personal assistants being like a common thing where personal assistants and agents would work in the background to do these things for you, or you would have your personal assistant essentially on all day. And I remember listening to that and I said to myself, what is there any like market research to see like how many people would want this? Because he acknowledges at one point that this has to be kind of something that people are opting into and presumably paying for. It wasn't quite clear to me the sense of like how pervasive this was going to be. And he just doesn't really, again, is it 10% or is it 90%? So a lot of this stuff wasn't quite clear exactly like in his mind how pervasive the technology was going to be, other than I think that he believes it's going to be pretty pervasive. There's one point in the book where he goes into a digression of virtual gaming, and some of that stuff, it made me think that he does not necessarily understand virtual gaming and the kind of appeals of playing with your friends based on what he said. And then let me see if there's any other notes that I wanted to put in here. Yeah, I guess that's the last part of it is kind of going back to if someone did have cognitive bias. I think one of his views of the technology is that people can use these AIs to reduce their cognitive bias in order for them to get to a point of understanding between people. And to me, it's like, well, people can do all kinds of things to do that, and they've chosen not to do them, and that's kind of why we are here. And some of the theories that he has seems to be kind of ignoring the power and pervasiveness of the internet as it currently is. And sometimes he'll write things about these technologies will allow people to communicate with people all over the world. I'm like, well, we've been doing this for 50 years, and still we have countries that are at war with each other. And I think some of this stuff does come down to values more than I think he would feel comfortable saying. So I don't know how artificial intelligence is going to change that unless, again, people are mindful enough to opt into this. And it's not clear why they would have that knowledge, that they would have to know that they're wrong, if that makes sense. So yeah, he does go into the downsides pretty heavily. And so if you're someone who is concerned about artificial intelligence, he goes into the downsides of them pretty thoroughly. And he has some sections that are kind of a mixture of both. He calls it the coins. It took me a while to understand what he's saying, but he's basically saying these are kind of two sides to the coin. So essentially, you're going to have where it's likely that jobs are going to be eliminated, and if you have a system that's set up to where people can still make money through some kind of redistributive policy, then they'll be without a job and they'll have a lot of free time. In his mind, I think that would free them up for addictions and other things that are not basically productive. But so he does have. I will say I think the book is pretty thorough in that nature. There are some things that he looks at as being completely bad, a few things that he looks at being completely good, and there's a few things that are kind of in between there, a mixture of good and bad that he kind of talks a little bit about. But I wish he had spent a little bit more time trying to track down people to talk about the positives, because most of the positives he talks about are extension of lifespan is kind of the big one, and I think that would be an unparalleled good for people. But you then get into questions of equitable equitable access to those technologies and things that the book is not really going to get into in its relatively limited space. So, who would I recommend this to? If you know Robert Wright, if you like his podcast, a lot of the ideas that are in this book are going to be familiar to you. If you're someone who, and I still enjoyed it reading it because I like his podcast and I like his voice. If you're kind of skeptical of some of his ideas about global governance and the likelihood of global governance, a large part of the book, the last third of the book, is about that. And if you found yourself going, well, couldn't we just have a system where, similar to what we do with the World Trade Organization or free trade organizations, couldn't we just have a system of rules without having to get to this level of higher consciousness that seems kind of perhaps unnecessary? Instead, you could have like a mitigation strategy instead of the strategy where kind of everybody has to rise to this level. And again, I think his beliefs are predicated on this idea that the technology will be continued to be used and will be continued to get more powerful, and that we will be moving towards the singleton. I think is his ultimate belief. Now, if you think that that's perhaps overblown or unlikely, again, one of the things that he believes is that the technology is going to keep increasing pretty substantially in terms of the power of the models, and has not reached a plateau yet, and that's really kind of the main question. And in his mind, after reading this book, I think he thinks that we are basically going to, over the next several years, maybe 5-10 years, continue to increase at the level that we're increasing. And so there's going to be very, very little that the models can't do. You get into the kind of the practical applications, and he spends a little bit of time talking about how you could use these to essentially, if there is no limitations to what they can do, then they could, in essence, replicate human intelligence. If you were able to put them in some kind of body, like a robot, you could essentially have a human-like worker who has all the functionality of a human. So things like hearing and speaking, taste and smell may not be as important, but those things could conceivably be done in a human-like, a robot body powered by an artificial intelligence. And so in that case, it's very, very limited to what these things can do. You would be looking at something like, I'm trying to think of what the Animatrix, there's an Animatrix segment in the Rise of the Machines or something. You would be essentially looking at like robots with like human intelligence or beyond human intelligence that we could use to do all kinds of things if we were so inclined to do. Now, who knows if we're ever going to get there, but that is a possibility of the technology. So I think it is an interesting read. I think that there's people who would push back on some of the central claims and beliefs. I think there is a question of, from a practical standpoint, as far as the scientific research and the extension of lifetime and eliminating diseases, you get into things like gene manipulation, stuff like that gets us into all kinds of places like bioethics and all this stuff that the book is not really interested in addressing, nor should it be. But my point is, it's an interesting read. If any of those things interest you, you're going to enjoy it. A lot of it is about the global governance. That's like the last third of the book. And so there, it does feel like sometimes where you're like, okay, we were talking about AI. Now we're going into talking about the importance of global governance and why there needs to be some kind of, rise in consciousness in order to meet this challenge. And so if you're someone who's more of a tech-oriented person, it may seem like a pretty strong veer to the right or left, whatever, off the road, to start talking about, meditation and things of that nature and a rise in consciousness. So, but for a lay audience, that first section of the book I think is really, really good. I think you can just pick that up. And if you're not interested so much in the consciousness stuff, I think you can just like stop reading at a certain point. If you're a fan of the podcast, you're probably going to enjoy it. I thought it was an interesting read. I mean, having known what he said about stuff, it was a nice general book. There are some things that I wish he had done more of. I wish there had been more on the like positive aspects of artificial intelligence. I wish there had been more skepticism about the ability for this to continue to grow, considering the cost involved. And if there is a stop in the growth, what does that mean? And if this thing has to make money at some point, what does that mean? Now, there are always governmental contracts to be had, so maybe that's the solution. But the book's wasn't interested in that. From his interest is much more in like the technology and what that means for the human species in conflict between nations than I think he is interested in like the business case for artificial intelligence and the day-to-day changes so much for people. I think he's going to assume, like the internet, that once it is like fully here and affordable, everybody will use it all the time. And to me, that wasn't like an assumption too far. You would probably need, again, some kind of market testing or something to actually check that out. Most people are using free versions of these technologies, and the companies are making money. A lot of that money is coming through the government contracts. I don't know how much value the day-to-day person, like what would you actually pay for this thing? The book's not really that interested in talking about it. But Robert Wright, The God Test, recent book just came out. Next time I will be reading something completely different, going backwards in time, going to Cloud Splitter by Russell Banks. I hope to have this out very shortly. I'm not almost done with it, but I only have a couple hundred pages left. Looking forward to reviewing that. So if you've enjoyed this, please feel free to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you've read Robert Wright's The God Test and there's anything you thought that I missed, he covers a lot of ground in the book, so I'm sure there's stuff that I missed, but please feel free to leave a comment below. I'll have my link to my Twitter page. Until next time, bye.